This last Tuesday was All Saints' Day. Traditionally, when Christians uh, would remember all those who died, that was the purpose of it. But it's pretty largely ignored these days. And in fact, dealing with death um, is pretty much ignored these days. People do not want to do it. It's not a topic people want to even think about. And I want to talk about today two ways that our culture is dealing with this topic that I don't think are very helpful. And I want to suggest a third way that I think we could particularly offer to the world as a different way of looking at death and help people through it. So let me first talk about the two ways that our culture deals with this topic. I'm going to start with a secular approach, and then I'm going to share a traditional Christian approach, and then a third way. So the secular approach to dealing with death is basically a strategy of denial. Our culture that in the secular world basically says that you want to do everything you can to distract yourself from the reality of death. You turn any talk about, when someone talks about death or dying, you basically say that's morbid, that's pessimistic, don't talk about it. If you speak of death, you wish it into existence. So it's very much just deny it. Um, and it makes sense in a culture that teaches that there's nothing more than what you can feel and see and touch, because death reminds people that no matter how much money we make, no matter what good shape our bodies are in, no matter what good work we did, no matter what healthy foods we eat, eventually we all die. And so that it kind of brings that worldview that building better, stronger, always moving forward, it kind of confronts that with the idea that actually you will die. And that creates great anxiety for people. So it makes sense that they would want to deny it, pretend it won't happen. In fact, people seem shocked when people die, but then they move on as quickly as possible. I've noticed a new trend occurring only in the last couple of years, where people are now saying, we're not going to hold a memorial service for somebody who died. The point is, let's just get beyond it. Let's get by it. Let's forget about it. This denying of death and avoiding it misses out the importance of focusing on the things in our life that are eternal, like meaning and purpose, and considering what's a good life and what we can do with our physical experience. The denial culture is making it challenging even for funeral directors. This past week, the Wall Street Journal had an article called How Morticians Are Putting Fun in Funerals, quoting a director who said, I'm selling a product nobody wants, but ultimately everybody has to have. The article noted that only about 15% of people over 40 had made any arrangements in writing about their death, and then only a third of them had paid anything toward it. One funeral director, speaking of the challenge of breaking through a secular culture of denial, said, we're convincing people that just talking about sex doesn't make you pregnant, and talking about death doesn't make you dead. The real world problem with this denial strategy in our culture is that very often it's almost superstitious, believing that if you talk about it, you'll create it, and that death is contagious, which is very odd for a secular culture. But what I find is that people don't even want to visit dying people. They don't want to acknowledge dying people for fear that they'll be reminded of their own mortality, and almost a fear like, if I engage with those people, I might get it too. The denial strategy isn't working, and it's not the only one that's not working. There's a traditional church strategy that isn't working either. Let me talk about that now. The traditional church strategy is one that basically uses death as a scare tactic to gain recruits. Reverend Billy Graham, one of the most famous preachers in American history, famously held altar calls. That's when you basically invite people to give their life to Christ at huge rallies. And very often he would state that death is the enemy of man and the enemy of God. And he would tell the story to the audience of the young man who came to the last rally. And that young man told Reverend Graham, I was very moved by your comments, but I'm not ready to give my life to Christ. And then he left, but he said, I'm going to come back to the next one. And that night, you know what happened, right? The man's motorcycle crashed and he died. And he didn't know Jesus and he went to hell. And then Graham would conclude, will you now come forward to accept Jesus tonight? And guess what? The scare tactics, they work in the short runs, and throngs came forward. The problem with dealing with death in this way is it doesn't reflect God. God never operates from the use of fear or manipulation. This way of dealing with death actually cheapens life and our importance of that we have a role here to play on the planet. It's not just about getting into heaven. We are here to learn to love others and fight for justice and be active in this life. And this worldview misses the point that life here is critical. It's a training area for the next life. Another problem that I've experienced with this view of death is it's very damaging to people in tough situations that are dying. A good example for me was when I was with a friend of mine, Eduardo. He was dying from AIDS. This big, healthy guy that I knew looked like a small, older woman shriveled up in a bed when I came to visit him in Boston. And he whispered to me something that others have also whispered to me at a time near death. They were not letting go because their faith had taught them that they were going to enter into a fiery pit of hell. Only when his father and myself talked him through the story of God's love for him and that he'd be welcome in the next life did he let go. But it's very painful that I hear so many people who suffer under this fear of death because they've been taught about a punishing, cruel God that wants nothing good for them because they haven't said the right magic words. A third way that I'm suggesting beyond this secular approach or this sort of manipulative approach is to look at death in the same way that we look at birth. We come out of a womb and there's a traumatic experience and we come into a new physical life. And I feel like that's probably the best analogy for death, is that we have this physical life here and we're preparing ourselves for heaven, and we go through, it can be a traumatic experience, it can be a scary experience, but we come into birth, we're birthed into a new life. And that every challenge and every bit of suffering that we had on this sphere has actually developed our souls in a way that when we come into that new life, that's the product of our life that we can come into. When we look at death through this lens, it really forces us in a good way to reflect on our life. What am I missing? What do I need to prepare? Each day here is precious. How do I make the most of it? How can I be a better person? These are the right questions that death can help us to enlarge our life when we use it to reflect. In today's reading, the story is called The Transfiguration, and many people who have been scholars look at it as Jesus planning his death, and he's engaged his spiritual guides, Moses and Elijah. And I think it's a good role model for us. Jesus never minimized his death, and he never minimized his purpose and his time on earth. That should be our model, the combination of looking at the next life and the importance of this life and leading into it. Swedenborg is most famous for his teachings on life after death. He gives us great solace in that he says that the mystery of death is open to us and teaches that death is a positive experience for all who are engaged in it. We are guided by angels with love into this next sphere, and it's a love beyond comprehension. So we are well taken care of in that period. When people that we love leave us, they are well taken care of. I just recently spoke to a couple who were quizzing me on our church's theology, and they were strongly Catholic, but they had lost a young child. And they asked me, what do you think happens to young kids? When I could explain our view that all children are accepted in heaven, the woman just said, that makes a lot more sense than that my child is in limbo or something. So I think these views, these very beautiful views of life after death, need to be shared and need to be out there with people who are living in either denial about it or in a manipulative view of death. Death can be a very beautiful experience. If you've had the chance to be with someone in their dying days, it's genuinely a spiritual honor, and it's a decisive moment in your life you won't forget. And one of the worst things that we can do at that time is tell people, hang on, because we fear their loss. It's a gift to be with them, but it's also a gift to let them go. That's the way I think we can offer a different way of looking at death, as a positive experience based on a life well lived. So at Church of the Holy City, every week we talk about these in the abstract, but we also say, are there any practices that I could develop in my life to engage in death that would give me a more meaningful life? And there are a couple practical things we can do. There's at least a couple. And I'm just going to share two really quickly. But one, I think, is practical. And this is the preacher preaching to himself. We need to do a better job of planning our funerals, our estates, deciding who's going to be the executor, and put it all in writing. And we need to stop putting it off. Because when we, one, it's a real burden on the people we leave behind to figure it out, the more complicated our mess is. So that's one thing. But the other is that as a pastor, I've dealt with many people who, at the time of their death, can't really live into it and can't really have peace in it, because they tell me, oh, Rich, I haven't dealt with this financial detail and I haven't dealt with that financial detail. So I'm hanging on, I'm clinging. And they're often clinging on to life beyond really the time when they should have let go. And when those life issues are taken care of for them, they usually do transition more peacefully. So there's a practical side to dealing with these issues. And I would love to even put a time on the church's calendar, a weeknight, some night, where any of us that want to discuss this topic just get together to figure out what's the best way to do a will, to do an executor, to plan a funeral, to pay for your funeral in advance so it's not left to others. Just these practical details that we tend to put off. Sure that we'll never have to deal with it, but we will. And someone else will have to deal with it if we don't. So that's the practical suggestion. At a more personal example I would give of how we can use death to plan life is an exercise that I once went through and I use in my own coaching practice. And this exercise about death significantly impacted my life when I did it. And what it asks you to do is to write out your funeral. And I know when you hear that, many of my clients are like, oh gosh, well, that's a real winner. That's really chipper. Thanks, Rich. It's a very powerful exercise if you can overcome those fears. And I can send this exercise to anybody who's interested, but it simply asks, where is it held? Who speaks? What do they say? Is there music? Who plays it? What kind of music? Who do you want to be there? And what are they saying? And you write it out as if it's happening. Now, after I did that exercise, I know in my own life, I asked, what do I need to change in my life so that I have that experience at the end? It's just called planning with the end in mind, and the ultimate end being a funeral. It's very powerful, and I've seen it be very transformative for clients. I would say it's game changing as they think, this is how I want to leave. What do I need to do to live to have that be the way I leave this space? So I feel like we need to embrace death to enlarge our life. And even with all of our planning, the truth is we don't know when will be our time to leave this earth. And many of us think we've got X number of years, and that's very possibly not true. So we need to live each day seriously and each day fully, and be practical and thoughtful and embrace death as part of life. Now, I'd like to close out today's sermon with a short little parable that always struck me as profound in describing that no matter how much we try to prevent death, ultimately, we are in God's hands. So this is a little parable. It's called The Appointment at Samarra. There was a merchant in Baghdad who sent his servant to buy provisions in the marketplace. And after a little while, the servant came back home, pale and trembling, and said, "Master, just now, when I was in the marketplace, I was jostled by a man in the crowd. And when I turned, I saw it was death that shook me. He looked at me and he made a threatening gesture. Please lend me your horse and I will ride away from the city to avoid my fate. I will go to Samarra and death will not find me there." So the merchant lent him his horse, and the servant mounted it, dug in his spurs, and rode as fast as the horse could gallop. Then the merchant went downtown to the marketplace, and there he saw Death standing in the crowd. And he came to Death and said, "Why did you make such a threatening gesture to my servant when you saw him this morning?" And Death said, "That was not a threatening gesture. I was just surprised. I was astonished to see him in Baghdad, for I have an appointment with him tonight in Samarra." All of us have that appointment, and we don't know the time, we don't know the place, but we can live a life that's more full in preparation for it. We can embrace the reality of our death as a gift, and each day know that it's a precious gift and an opportunity to do more good, so that when our time does come, we can hear God welcoming us into the heaven saying, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Amen.